We good to go? We're looking good? Okay. All right, everybody. I am Dana Schoaf, Director of Interpretation for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I'd like to welcome you all here this afternoon. A little drizzly, rainy afternoon. Is it odd for me to say it's kind of nice in a way after the glaring hot summer we had to see sort of a gentle, rainy day out there? But I'm so glad you came in and are going to hear this talk because it's going to be really interesting. And if any of you are not members, I've got membership brochures in the back that if you'd like to take one home and consider joining and becoming a member of the museum, it helps us and gives you some great benefits. You get a magazine, you'll get a quarterly newsletter, an e-newsletter, and a print magazine, I should say. And we also have special member events throughout the year that you'll get notice about as well, and some advance notice of some things we have going on here. And right now, I have to tell you, it's a very exciting time because we are at the very beginning of a really cool redesign of the museum. Now, these things don't move quickly. It's going to take a while, but we've been working with a design firm in DC, and some of the things we've got cooked up are going to be really fabulous, I think. So it's an exciting time to be connected to the museum. And there's actually, we may be even crowdsourcing some ideas and some help for this redesign. So if you're a member, you can be part of that as well. So anyway, on to the matter of the day. We are here to listen to my friend, Michelle Kroll, give a talk about a very unique and extraordinary woman of the Civil War period. And Michelle, of course, I asked for a bio blurb, and she sent this little thing here, but I'll go through it. It's pretty much more extensive. Because Michelle has a cool job. She is a Civil War and Reconstruction Specialist in the Manuscript Division at the Library of Congress.
Yeah.
That means Michelle gets to go in and look at diaries and letters and papers of people like Abraham Lincoln and Clara Barton, and people we've never heard of that probably have information just as fascinating, if not more. Mm-hmm. And that's what her day job is. She gets to catalog these things, look at them, and I really need to get down there and visit you and just Google some of the stuff you have.
Yes, you do.
And Michelle and I have crossed paths before, most notably at a conference in November, every November in Gettysburg, the Lincoln Forum. And I think that's how we met.
I think so too, yeah.
I think that's how we met. So I see her up throughout the year, but always at the Lincoln Forum, I can always catch up there too. She received a BA in history from the University of California, Riverside, and an MA and PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley. Should we be calling you Dr. Kroll?
Yes.
Technically, I just go by Michelle.
You never actually use that on any correspondence that I've seen anyway.
No, just on my email signature it says PhD,
Okay.
just so people know I'm legit.
She's legit, yeah. Well, she's legit. Michelle is the author of several articles and books on topics relating to the Civil War, as well as Quantico, Virginia, and the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. So Quantico is because of the Marine base. Am I off there, or?
Well, Quantico, a colleague and I got asked to do a history of Quantico, Virginia through the Heritage Foundation of the Marine Corps, but we actually looked at the entire history of the base, or actually the site from kind of colonial period up until the present.
Interesting.
So. Mm-hmm.
That's a wide range of eras to research. Which is your personal favorite? I'm going to put you on the spot.
The Civil War.
Civil War.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. She has also worked as a library assistant at the Historical Society of Washington, D.C., an assistant professor at Northern Virginia Community College, and as a research assistant for historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, who wrote Team of Rivals. Mm-hmm. And she didn't put on here, and I wish I had a visual representation of this, but Michelle also has a very unique lawn ornament because she had a tree cut down, how many years ago?
About 2 years ago. Do you want me to explain what it is?
Yes.
Okay. Well, So in Arlington, Virginia, where I live, we're having oak decline, which we have tons of oak trees and they're starting to fade. And so I was taking down 2 beautiful oak trees in my yard and I wanted to save one. And one that was right next to my dining room window was very tall and thin. And I knew that there was a tree sculptor in my area who does very cool work. And so I actually have Abraham Lincoln in my front yard now.
Sculpture, Abraham Lincoln standing almost life size. It's very cool looking.
And I have to say, the funny thing now is anytime we get a storm coming through, no one asks how I am. It's all, how is Mr. Lincoln? Is he okay?
Mr. Lincoln make it to the storm.
Yes, I said it was a fiery trial, but he is there.
That's awesome. And I briefly want to mention, I think you're going to mention this too, I was fortunate to be one of the collaborators with Michelle in this book, Final Resting Places, Reflections on the Meaning of Civil War Graves. And I gave a talk last month about my subject, which is a young man who died here on the B&O Railroad. And Michelle has a very compelling essay on her subject, Elizabeth Keckly, and visiting her grave and talking about Elizabeth Keckly's life. So without further ado, I'm going to sit down and Michelle will take you through the extraordinary life of this extraordinary woman.
All right, thanks, Dana.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming out on a Saturday afternoon and spending the day with us talking about history. So, let's see. Oops, sorry, let me go back. Okay. This presentation, as Dana suggested, is adapted from a chapter I contributed to Final Resting Places, Reflections on the Meaning of Civil War Graves, edited by Brian Matthew Jordan and Jonathan W. White. In their respective essays, 28 Civil War historians, including Dana, whose one is up there. Let's see where it is. There's Dana. Okay. I know my audience. 28 Civil War historians consider a Civil War grave or resting place of significance to them or their work. Some of their essays are more straightforward histories, others are more personal reflections. My essay, Not So Final Resting Places, Grave Reflections on the Historical Reputation of Elizabeth Keckly, was a mixture of both the historical and the personal. And I mention this at the outset, both because it provided me an opportunity to revisit Elizabeth Keckly, both in literal and figurative ways, and because it helps explain why graves and cemeteries are such a central theme in my presentation today, apart from the fact it's just a fun subject. To look upon a grave and not feel certain whose ashes repose beneath the sod is painful, and the doubt which mystifies you weakens the force, if not the purity, of the love offering from the heart. This is how former slave Elizabeth Keckly explained her decision not to visit the final resting place of her beloved mother, buried in an unmarked grave in a public cemetery in Vicksburg, Mississippi. While Keckly moved north after buying her freedom in 1855, her enslaved mother followed the Garland family to Vicksburg, after which Keckly, quote, lost sight of the family for a few years, and thus the location of her mother's grave as well. While my connection lacks the intimacy of a family member, I understood Keckly's sentiment when I first tried to visit Elizabeth Keckly's grave in October 1995. After writing an undergraduate seminar paper on Keckly, the African-American modiste and confidant of First Lady Mary Lincoln, I pledged to place flowers on her grave at Harmony Cemetery on a future visit to Washington, D.C. That opportunity came in 1995 while I was conducting dissertation research. I knew from John E. Washington's book, 1942 book, They Knew Lincoln, that Keckly had made arrangements to be buried at Harmony Cemetery, a prominent African-American cemetery in northeast Washington, D.C., and that a granite headstone marked her tomb. When ready to fulfill my promise, however, I was confused to find that Harmony Cemetery was now listed as the National Harmony Memorial Park in Landover, Maryland. More concerning was discovering that Keckly's grave bore no marker at all, as was the case for many of the graves in the Costin section of the cemetery. cemetery staff provided me with an approximate location near a section marker where Keckly's grave's remains should be located, but in Keckly's own words, I could, quote, not feel certain of whose ashes reposed beneath the sod. I paid my respects and left my floral offering as best I could, but the visit felt very incomplete. For a woman who learned large in my own studies and served as an important witness of the Lincoln White House, to have been forgotten and neglected in death seemed wrong. At the time, I thought about purchasing a tombstone for Keckly using my own funds, or perhaps trying to contact Oprah Winfrey, who had voiced Keckly's words in an ABC documentary on Abraham Lincoln. That was really my dad's suggestion. Contact Oprah, she'll do it. It was a good one. As you'll see, I didn't do it. But I confess that my own life and cares got in the way, and I failed to pursue either option. But as it turned out, the state of Elizabeth Keckly's grave often mirrored her own historical reputation, and both proved ready for a renaissance in the early 2000s. Born into slavery in Virginia in 1818, Elizabeth Hobbs Keckly was enslaved by the family of Colonel Armistead Burwell, who was also her biological father. Burwell loaned the teenaged Elizabeth to his eldest son, Robert, who in 1835 took her with his family to Hillsborough, North Carolina, where he accepted a church position. Here, Elizabeth personally experienced the violence of slavery more than ever before. The Burwells engaged a neighbor to whip her, which Keckly resisted with as much force as she could. Another white man in Hillsborough, Alexander Kirkland, pursued and sexually violated her, leading to the birth of her only child, George. By 1842, she and her son had returned to Virginia, where she was reunited with her mother. In 1847, Colonel Burwell's daughter, Anne, and her husband, Hugh Garland, moved to St. Louis, Missouri, taking Elizabeth and her immediate family with them. While the Garlands' social standing remained high, their coffers continued to empty, and Hugh Garland contemplated renting out Elizabeth's mother, Agnes. Horrified at the thought of her mother leaving the only family that she had known, Elizabeth offered to use her skills as a seamstress to generate income. Garland agreed, and Elizabeth successfully, quote, kept the bread in the mouths of 17 persons for 2 years and 5 months, including the Garland family, who could, in Elizabeth's words, live in comparative comfort and move in those circles of society to which their birth gave them entrance. This arrangement changed the course of Elizabeth's life. As a sought-after dressmaker for prominent women in St. Louis, Elizabeth made connections in the white community. After Hugh Garland set $1,200 as the price of freedom for Elizabeth and her son in 1852, several white clients later advanced her the money in 1855. Elizabeth decided to seek a new life in the North in 1860, following the death of her mother in 1857, the failure of her marriage to the dissipated James Keckly, and the enrollment of her son at Wilberforce University. Elizabeth ultimately settled in Washington, D.C., where her St. Louis connections provided her entree to the ladies of political Washington. This included Verena Davis, the wife of then Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, who offered to take Elizabeth south with them when Jefferson Davis joined the Confederate government. Keckly's ambition, however, proved higher than that. So basically she said no. Good choice. As she said, ever since arriving in Washington, I had a great desire to work for the ladies of the White House. And to accomplish this end, I was ready to make almost any sacrifice consistent with propriety. Her chance arrived in March 1861 when the new First Lady, Mary Lincoln, required a dressmaker to replace a gown spoiled in an accident. Keckly's good reputation preceded her, and after assuring Mrs. Lincoln of reasonable prices, she became Mary Lincoln's primary modiste for the next 4 years. It's difficult to know with any certainty which of Mary Lincoln's many gowns Keckly's workshop produced for her. Mrs. Lincoln was photographed in several different gowns, and it's possible that all or some of them were Keckly's creations. One gown most often credited to Keckly is this royal purple satin bodice and skirt, piped with white satin and adorned with mother-of-pearl buttons. This dress is now part of the Smithsonian Institution's First Ladies collection. In addition to serving as Mary Lincoln's modiste, Keckly also became an intimate of the Lincoln family, observing the domestic side of the White House as few did during the Civil War. She witnessed episodes of playful banter between President Lincoln and his wife, such as Lincoln's comment on the style of the gown Mrs. Lincoln wore to her reception in early 1862. "Whew, our cat has a long tail tonight," the president exclaimed. When his style-conscious wife failed to answer, he glanced at her bare neck and arms and ventured, "Mother, it is my opinion that if some of that tail was nearer the head, it would be in better style." I don't think she said anything to that either. In 1863, Keckly observed a dejected president transformed after reading the Bible and contrived to sneak a peek at the book. She discovered that Lincoln appropriately had been reading the book of Job. She also overheard Mary Lincoln express to her husband her negative opinions on Union generals and which ladies she jealously forbade him from speaking to at social gatherings. Both Lincolns acknowledged Keckly's presence in the room, so their candor was not a result of not seeing the quote-unquote help, as was the case in so many other households. They welcomed her into their private spaces to dress Mrs. Lincoln and clearly thought that she could be trusted to keep what she observed to herself. Keckly later recounted having refused more than one bribe to provide White House access or learn the Lincoln secrets. "Sooner than betray the trust of a friend," Keckly told one schemer, "I would throw myself into the Potomac River." Mary Lincoln especially came to rely on Keckly's consoling presence during her many times of trial and tragedy during the Civil War. Keckly was one of the few people who could calm Mary Lincoln during her profound grief after the death of her son Willie in 1862 and the assassination of her husband in 1865. Perhaps Mary Lincoln found in the African-American Keckly a reminder of the enslaved women, the first enslaved women in the Todd family home on whom Mary had relied for comfort as a child. "Elizabeth, you are my best and kindest friend," Mary Lincoln once told Keckly, "and I love you as my best friend." Keckly's association with the Lincolns and other prominent women who formed her clientele in Washington provided Keckly with an unusual financial and social status for a woman of her race. Beginning in 1862, Keckly used her connections to form and help fund the Contraband Relief Association, of which she served as president for several years. The association provided aid to formerly enslaved people in their transition from freedom during and after the Civil War. Many formerly enslaved persons in Virginia and Maryland sought refuge in Washington, D.C., particularly after slavery was abolished in the district in April of 1862. But these refugees from enslavement arrived without basic necessities or essential resources and required assistance to make the initial transition from slavery to freedom. When Elizabeth accompanied Mary Lincoln on trips north, she made connections with others interested in the plight of former enslaved persons in an effort to generate donations of cash or needed supplies. In November 1862, Keckly accompanied Mary Lincoln on a trip north, during which Keckly endeavored to collect supplies for the contrabands then residing in Washington. Mary Lincoln wrote this letter to her husband that she had made the executive decision to tap into a $1,000 fund at the president's disposal to authorize Keckly to purchase bedding for refugees. "I have given her the privilege of investing $200 here in bed covering," Mrs. Lincoln wrote to her husband. "She is the most deeply grateful being I ever saw, and this sum I am sure you will not object to being used in this way. The cause of humanity requires it, and there will be $800 left of the fund. I am sure this will meet with your approbation." Notice she did that after she had already given the $200, but Abraham Lincoln's death on April 15, 1865, not only changed the course of the nation's history, but also the life of Elizabeth Keckly. Mary Lincoln suffered, quote, "wild, tempestuous outbursts of grief from the soul," and few but Elizabeth could calm her. Keckly remained with Lincoln for weeks after the president's assassination. Abolitionist Julia Wilbur, then living in nearby Alexandria, Virginia, was acquainted with both Keckly and Josephine Slade, the wife of the African-American White House usher, William Slade. Wilbur visited both ladies just after Lincoln's assassination and noted in her diary that Mrs. Slade and Mrs. Keckly, quote, have been with Mrs. Lincoln nearly all the time since the murder, not as servants, but as friends, and she underlines friends. According to Wilbur, Mrs. Lincoln said she chose them because her husband was appreciated by the colored race. The colored race understood him. And it seemed that Elizabeth Keckly understood Mary Lincoln. After helping to comfort Mrs. Lincoln and pack the former First Lady's personal belongings, Keckly was persuaded to leave her own business establishment to help the Lincolns, which then consisted of Mary, her sons Robert and Tad, get settled in Chicago. I had been with her so long, Keckly explained, that she had acquired great power over me. Mary Lincoln continued to turn to Elizabeth for assistance, disastrously so in 1867. During her time as First Lady, Mary Lincoln had amassed tens of thousands in shopping debts. She rashly proposed selling the gowns and jewelry she would no longer wear and naively trusted agents in New York to manage the scheme. Mary implored Elizabeth to help her in what became known as the old clothes scandal. The agents mishandled the operation, and instead of a quiet, anonymous sale, Mrs. Lincoln's belongings went on display for purchase and perusal by the public. Mary Lincoln's reputation had sunk even lower in the public estimation, and Elizabeth Keckly was left in New York to sort out the mess while her own finances suffered while she remained unable to attend to her own business interests. To assist in Mary Lincoln's public rehabilitation and to demonstrate her own upright behavior in the relationship, in 1868, Keckly published Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House. My own character, as well as the character of Mrs. Lincoln, is at stake, since I have been intimately associated with that lady in the most eventful periods of her life, Keckly wrote. To defend myself, I must defend the lady whom I served, or that I have served. The book combined elements of a slave narrative, autobiography, and expose of the Lincoln White House, and it proved catastrophic for its author. Far from throwing herself in the Potomac River rather than betray her friend, Keckly shared intimate details of the Lincolns' domestic life and related Mary Lincoln's candid opinions on notable public figures, such as her calling General Ulysses S. Grant a butcher for the heavy casualties his military campaigns produced. Even if she genuinely sought to arouse the public's sympathy for Mary Lincoln, readers learned from Elizabeth Keckly that Abraham Lincoln once threatened to send his wife to a mental institution if she could not control herself and went mad with grief after the death of their son Willie in 1862. She told the world about Mary Lincoln's sizable shopping debts and how the First Lady conspired to keep the knowledge of them from her husband. Elizabeth Keckly recounted a conversation with Mrs. Lincoln in which the latter admitted her personal stake in her husband's reelection in 1864, which would keep the wolves at bay a little longer. Mary also thought the Republicans should pay off her debts because so many had received financial benefit from all the patronage positions her husband had given them. Even the benign and heartwarming stories Keckly told of life inside the Lincoln White House were still glimpses into an intimate world she had previously kept to herself. Worse still, Keckly entrusted her editor, James Redpath, with many of Mary Lincoln's letters to be consulted for context, and they were instead published as an appendix to the book. Even glancing at the first of Mary Lincoln's letters in the appendix here, written on October 6, 1867, makes it readily apparent why this portion of the book proves so problematic. Mrs. Lincoln ends by telling Keckly, "Pray for me that this cup of affliction may pass from me, or be sanctified to me. I weep whilst I am writing. I pray for death this morning. Only my darling Tatty prevents my taking my life. I shall have to endure a round of newspaper abuse from the Republicans because I dared venture to relieve a few of my wants. Tell Mr. Brady and Keyes not to have a line of mine once more in print. I am nearly losing my reason." And we must remember that Keckly's book appeared only 3 years after Abraham Lincoln's death, and at a time when emotions were still raw and many of the people about whom Keckly wrote were still very much alive. Coincidentally, The book hit bookstores in late April 1868, while Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, faced impeachment trials in Congress. And just by happenstance, this issue of the Evening Star was reporting on the impeachment trials and had an advertisement for Keckly's book, which was just coming out. Additionally, Keckly's book provided an intimate view into the Lincoln's domestic world in an era when the public and private spheres remained largely separate. In trying to demonstrate her own upright behavior and excite sympathy for Mary Lincoln, Keckly's book drew back the curtains and violated the sanctity of the Lincoln home by sharing their private thoughts and conversations for all the world to read. Keckly's quote-unquote literary thunderbolt drew condemnation as a betrayal of the Lincolns. The National Intelligencer newspaper in Washington, D.C. published a scathing editorial about what it called a book of scandal. It called Keckly this treacherous creature with a moral obtuseness that apparently takes no cognizance of fidelity to a trust nor the sacredness of a home. Another reviewer thought that gossip mongers would enjoy the revelations in the book, but, quote, like most such gossip, the incidents narrated do not add to the respect which the reader feels for the characters figuring in the history. Another reviewer called it, quote, a book in which every decent person will agree with us in pronouncing a disgrace at once to the persons who have written it, to the publishers who issued it, and to the public who stooped to buy and read it. And on it went. Even those reviewers who singled out other aspects of the book as interesting or useful also commented on the element of betrayal that was associated with Keckly's work, regardless of her stated intent to improve the public's opinion of Mary Lincoln and her many trials during the war. The reviewer for the Daily Evening Bulletin of San Francisco, however, provided one of the more unintentionally humorous comments, describing the book as spicy with a genuine element of scandal. Readers who did not buy the book might have become familiar with the content about the Lincolns through the extensive excerpts published and republished in newspapers across the country in the spring of 1868. Not surprisingly, Keckly's book ruined her friendship with Mary Lincoln, who thereafter dismissed Keckly as, quote-unquote, the colored historian. Current evidence suggests that Mary Lincoln and Elizabeth Keckly had no further contact after the publication of the book, despite their previous close relationship. Mary's son may have tried to have the book suppressed, and it certainly generated no meaningful income for Keckly. By the spring of 1865, Keckly operated a successful dressmaking business that employed several workers. But Keckly thereafter lost revenue when she agreed to accompany Mary Lincoln to Chicago after Lincoln's assassination and during her participation in the old clothes scandal in New York. The backlash against Behind the Scenes in 1868 no doubt cost her the trust of many former notable clients who must have wondered what information Keckly would relay about them. Thus, the book proved to be a financial disaster for Keckly as well as a personal one. Keckly's book also inspired a racist parody titled Behind the Seams by an N-word woman who took in work from Mrs. Lincoln and Mrs. Davis, which was also published in 1868. In this publication, a semi-literate Betsy Keckly relates several of the same stories as the real Keckly did in Behind the Scenes, but often does so in base language and with the express aim of making money from her proximity to power. Although a limited edition pamphlet, which few Americans probably likely even had a chance to read, Behind the Scenes did nothing to enhance Keckly's reputation or Mary Lincoln's or Keckly's motivations for writing Behind the Scenes. Not only did Keckly lose her good name for a while, but for over a century, she also lost her name itself. While the book was published under the surname Keckly with 2 E's, she signed documents using the surname Keckly with 1 E. The pension application she filed during the Civil War after the death of her son George in 1861 was signed with Keckly with 1 E. Her son George Kirkland was able to pass as a white man and enlisted in the Union Army in 1861, and he was killed at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in Missouri that same year in 1861. Similarly, in 1891, she wrote to Jesse Wyke and signed the letter with the surname Keckly with 1 E. Wyke had assisted Abraham Lincoln's last law partner, William Herndon, with his research and writing, and White continued with his Lincoln studies after Herndon's death. In 1891, Keckly sent samples of fabric she had retained from one of Mary Lincoln's dresses, as well as strands of hair she had cut from the corpses of both Willie and Abraham Lincoln. As a trusted intimate of the Lincoln White House, she not only revered the two deceased Lincolns, but she had access to both of the bodies, so it's fairly reasonable that she cut the hair at that time. Many 19th century Americans clipped locks of hair from loved ones as a keepsake, and in this, Keckly was no different. And as an aside, I can tell you, we have so much hair in our collections. It's everywhere. But her communication to Jesse White provides additional evidence of how Keckly actually spelled her name. While she had been called many names during her lifetime, and her surname had been misspelled many times before, behind the scenes perpetuated the spelling as Keckly with the additional E for years to come. Less is known about Keckly's life after leaving the Lincoln's orbit. She remained a respected figure in Washington's African American community, where she was active in her church and admired for her dignity, intelligence, and fashion sense. Keckly's bearing had always struck those around her favorably. In May 1865, for example, Julia Wilbur described Keckly as good-looking, very ladylike in her appearance, and graceful in her manners. After leaving the Lincolns, the publication of Behind the Scenes, and a brief but unsuccessful attempt in June 1868 at giving public readings probably for money, Keckly returned to her sewing for her support, in addition to the small pension that she received from the government after her son George's death. In the immediate aftermath of the book debacle, Keckly seems to have taken what employment she could find. After having once refused to fit and cut a dress for Martha Johnson Patterson that President Johnson's daughter then wanted to finish herself using her own sewing machine, in October 1868, the millinery goods establishment E. Lensberg and Company advertised that they had, quote, secured the services of the well-known Mrs. E. Keckly as cutter, fitter, and superintendent of their dress and cloak-making departments. Ladies desirous of making up their own materials can have the same cut and fitted. Exactly what she said she would not do for Andrew Johnson's daughter. So for Keckly, it was probably one of those needs-must situations. In 1862, Keckly accepted a teaching position at Wilberforce University and helped organize its display at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. Sometime in the 1890s, she then returned to Washington, where she lived modestly at the National Home for Destitute Colored Women and Children. She died at the home on May 26, 1907. Consistent with the self-reliance that characterized her life, she had made arrangements for her death and burial. Reflective of the racial segregation of living in Washington in 1907, burials in most cemeteries, or sections within the cemeteries in the capital region, were segregated by race. Keckly chose to be buried at the Columbian Harmony Cemetery in Northeast Washington, D.C. Originally established in the 1820s as part of an African American mutual aid society, at the time of Keckly's death, Harmony Cemetery had become a prominent burial ground for Black Washingtonians. Keckly's estate paid $304 for the undertaker, her grave at the Columbian Harmony Cemetery, and the monument that marked what she anticipated would be her final resting place. At the grave, at least, we should be permitted to lay our burdens down, she once wrote. But Keckly could not control events of the living world. After failing to achieve much circulation in 1868, Behind the Scenes was republished in 1931. By 1935, however, not only did Keckly's authorship of Behind the Scenes come into question, but journalist David Raghan Barbie also claimed that no such person as Elizabeth Keckly had even existed. He thought Keckly was an invention of the abolitionist writer Jane Swisshelm. Amateur historian John E. Washington had studied Keckly's life and quickly disputed Barbie's assertion, leading Barbie to acknowledge both his error and the existence of Elizabeth Keckly. But the incident with Barbie inspired John Washington to conduct further research and publish the stories he had heard since childhood of African Americans who personally knew Abraham Lincoln. Elizabeth Keckly assumed a prominent place in Washington's 1942 book, They Knew Lincoln, which reproduced several documents relating to Keckly's life. Washington also included a photograph of Keckly's grave and tombstone at Harmony Cemetery and his description of the spot. On a beautiful knoll facing the east, beneath a mammoth spreading elm tree, rests forever all that remains of Elizabeth Keckly, he wrote. Mrs. Keckly's name and date of death are carved on the face of her tomb, and she selected these words from Psalm 127, second verse, to be inscribed beneath them. For so he giveth his beloved sleep. For Elizabeth Keckly and other residents of Harmony Cemetery, however, forever ended in the year 1960, when Harmony moved. Originally located on what is now Florida Avenue Northwest, in the late 1850s, the Columbian Harmony Cemetery moved to another location on Rhode Island Avenue Northeast, after new ordinances prohibited the establishment of new cemeteries within the bounds of the city of Washington and made continued operation for existing cemeteries within the city limits difficult. The Rhode Island Avenue site was located outside the then city of Washington, but still within the District of Columbia. Some eagle-eyed viewers may notice Harmony's proximity to the Edgewood estate, which is kind of that pink part there, that once belonged to Salmon P. Chase, an abolitionist who served as Lincoln's contentious first Secretary of the Treasury and then as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. By the time this map was drawn in 1891, Chase's once celebrated daughter, Kate, had inherited the property, which then deteriorated along with her own finances. And because someone previously asked what this area looks like today, this is a Google Earth map of the same area, a little more developed than in her day. Like the Chase property, nearby Harmony Cemetery eventually suffered reversals as well. After having been one of the preeminent African American cemeteries in Washington, at the turn of the century, lack of land for expansion, increasing maintenance costs, and declining revenues plunged the cemetery into financial crisis by the 1930s. By the 1950s, the physical state of the cemetery reflected its disordered finances, ultimately prompting the Columbian Harmony Cemetery, or the Columbian Harmony Society, to sell the Rhode Island Avenue to property developer Lewis N. Bell in 1958. Bell agreed to expand a cemetery in Landover, Maryland, to accommodate the existing Columbian Harmony Cemetery spots and involve the society in the new National Harmony Memorial Park. Bell also agreed to pay for the disinterment and reinterment in the new cemetery of the 37,000 remains at the old site, which included those of Elizabeth Keckly. Part of the old Harmony Cemetery site on Rhode Island Avenue in Northwest Washington, D.C., was ultimately incorporated into the Rhode Island Avenue Brentwood Metro subway station, opened in 1976. Today, a plaque at the Metro station serves as a silent witness to the former use of this site and its significance in African American history in Washington, D.C., and the individuals who once were interred there. So if you ever go to Rhode Island Metro, you'll now know a little bit more of the site. While the agreement with Lewis Bell specified that he would fund the removal of the remains, nothing was said regarding the fate of the existing tombstones and monuments on the graves. Apparently, the markers were either plowed under at the old cemetery or hauled off as debris. In 2009, hikers discovered some old Harmony headstones forming part of a ripraps constructed on the shore of the Potomac River in King George County, Virginia. Almost a decade later, former Virginia State Senator Richard Stewart also came across gravestones that formed part of the river ripraps on his newly purchased Potomac River property. He notified historians and other experts, and the unfortunate fate of the Harmony tombstones became national news. These discoveries have led to some efforts by local governments to try to find them and have an appropriate spot in the new Harmony Cemetery given over to memorializing those identities. In 1960, however, no one seems to have been paying attention to Elizabeth Keckly to ensure that her tombstone accompanied her remains. Without direct descendants or friends to monitor the marking of her grave, Keckly's remains at the new Harmony Cemetery were left unmarked, just as her mother's had been in Vicksburg over a century before. And to the best of my knowledge, the tombstone on Keckly's grave, which was shown in Johnny Washington's They Knew Lincoln, has not been found among the debris. Someday it could be found on a Potomac River riprap, or it may have been plowed under when the cemetery was redeveloped for industrial purposes. But like her tombstone in the 1960s, Elizabeth Keckly's name largely seemed to start to fade from history, apart from Lincoln scholars who continued to use behind the scenes as an essential resource for the domestic side of the Lincoln White House. Renewed interest in African American history following the civil rights movement of the 1960s occasionally generated interest in Keckly's memoirs, and various publishers reprinted behind the scenes every 20 or 30 years or so. But John E. Washington's important They Knew Lincoln remained out of print for decades, so thus the content of Elizabeth Keckly and about her was difficult to access. Keckly continued to serve as a witness or a source, but rarely as a focus of research in her own right. And so her unmarked grave in the Maryland cemetery reflected her status on the periphery. But a new millennium brought a welcome change to Elizabeth Keckly's historical reputation. In 2003, Professor Jennifer Fleischner published the dual biography, Mrs. Lincoln and Mrs. Keckly, which not only gave Elizabeth equal billing with Mary Lincoln, but also prompted a reevaluation of the spelling of Keckly's surname in light of historical evidence. While you still see it often spelled with the additional E, just as often now you'll see it spelled without that E. So increasingly you see it as she wrote it instead. Steven Spielberg's 2012 movie Motion Picture Lincoln included Elizabeth Keckly as a supporting character, played by actress Gloria Reuben. In 2013, Jennifer Chiaverini published her novel about Elizabeth Keckly, Mrs. Lincoln's Dressmaker, and Tazewell Thompson's play Mary L. and Lizzie Kay ran at the Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. George Saunders quoted Keckly repeatedly in his 2017 blockbuster novel, Lincoln in the Bardo, introducing Keckly to an entirely new audience. Professor Kate Mazur shepherded a welcome 2018 republication of They Knew Lincoln, and later that year, the New York Times included Keckly in one of its Overlooked No More series of obituaries devoted to historical figures who had been neglected at the time of their own death. Academics also increasingly gave Keckly her due with scholarly articles devoted to various aspects of her life, some of which were collected by Sheila Smith McCoy in the 2-volume Elizabeth Keckly Reader. Tamika Nunley's contributions to the book New Perspectives on the Union War in 2019 examined Keckly's wartime experiences with almost, or maybe no references to Abraham and Mary Lincoln. In addition to regular republication of new reprint editions of Behind the Scenes that are easy to access, the proliferation of digitized books in the public domain included Behind the Scenes, which is now available to anyone with an internet connection. And I've included a QR code on the screen to the freely available HathiTrust catalog page for Behind the Scenes, from which copies of the books have been digitized from various repositories and can be read online. So if you miss the code now and you want to read it later, I'm happy to return to this slide later. You can just point your cell phone at it. It'll take you right there. You've got your evening's entertainment right before you. The Commonwealth of Virginia, in which Elizabeth Hobbs was born enslaved in 1818, has honored her achievements in 2 ways. In 2011, a Virginia State Historic Marker was authorized to be placed near Keckly's birth site in Dinwiddie County, Virginia, to acknowledge her work for Mary Lincoln, her authorship of Behind the Scenes, and to a more limited extent, her activism against slavery. In 2019, a statue of Keckly was included as one of the initial 7 women honored in the Virginia Women's Monument, unveiled on the Virginia State Capitol grounds in Richmond, Virginia. When Keckly visited the Capitol building on a trip to Richmond with the Lincolns after the Confederate Capitol fell in April of 1865, she picked up some papers left behind in the legislative chamber. Among the documents in her hands was a resolution prohibiting free African Americans from entering the Commonwealth of Virginia. She liked that. Not only had she returned to her native state as a free woman in 1865, now she is also enshrined on the Capitol grounds as a notable woman in Virginia history. And in 2021, Elizabeth Keckly was the focal point of a children's book titled Stitch by Stitch, Elizabeth Hobbs Keckly Sews Her Way to Freedom by author Connie Schofield Morrison and illustrator Elizabeth Zunon. The title theme of Stitch by Stitch serves as a through line in the book in which each stitch Keckly executes essentially moves her that much closer to freedom. The all-important illustrations of children's books, in this case, offers oil paintings of the people and the scenes described, as well as also incorporates images of actual fabrics, samples of fabric, ribbon, and trimmings, appliques, stitch embroidery, lace, the whole thing. This mixed media presentation is appropriate to the story of a woman whose trajectory in life was defined by fabric and the tools of the sewing trade, as well as one who overcame obstacles and challenges and persevered stitch by stitch. This renewed attention on Elizabeth Keckly in the early 2000s extended to her final resting place as well. In 2009, researcher Richard Smith alerted several historical organizations about the unmarked location of Keckly's grave, which prompted an effort to rectify the situation. The Surratt Society, the Lincoln Forum, and other groups raised funds for a marker, which was dedicated at the National Harmony Memorial Park on May 26, 2010, the 103rd anniversary of Keckly's death. The new marker includes her name and life dates, a photograph, a copy of her signature, spelled correctly, a brief history of her life, and describes her as enslaved, modiste, confidant. On a sunny Sunday morning in September 2019, just shy of 24 years since my first attempt to visit Elizabeth Keckly's grave, I once again journeyed to the National Harmony Memorial Park in Landover. Armed with the grave number and a general memory of the location in the Coston section of the park, I easily located Keckly's grave on a gentle slope. Unlike several markers I passed that honored the memory of unknown quote-unquote remains found at Columbian Harmony Cemetery in the early 2000s, Keckly's new marker proclaims her identity and invites contemplation of her extraordinary life. Unlike my 1995 offering from the heart, this visit felt complete. The marker over Elizabeth Keckly's grave provided a recognized spot at which to pay my respects and leave some royal purple flowers in homage to Mary Lincoln's purple dress at the Smithsonian, most often credited to Keckly's craftsmanship. All these years later, my pledge to leave flowers at Elizabeth Keckly's grave had been fulfilled at last. Thank you.
That's remarkable because not only was this a historical investigation for you, this is a little bit of a personal journey for you as well. That makes it even more symbolic. I'm going to open it up for questions. I have a real quick question. I hope it's quick. Her book, Keckly's book, is this the first sort of public accusation of the spendthrift ways of Mary Todd? Is this something that really started that idea in the public's mind?
That's actually a good question. I haven't ever tried to find the timeline of it. I mean, I think it was other people knew about it.
Okay.
And, so for example, Benjamin Brown French, who was the Commissioner of Public Buildings in the District of Columbia, he has a great diary. That's another one that's worth reading. But he was the one that often had to mediate between Mary Lincoln getting bills and having to talk to Abraham Lincoln. And so he's the one that comes up with, or kind of shares, not at the time, but in his later published diary, and which is at the Library of Congress, by the way, that when B.B. French had to kind of say, well, Mrs. Lincoln's overspent her appropriation, and can you do this? And he basically said, I'm not going to spend this money on flub dubs for this damn old house. This is the best place we've ever lived. But, so I think other people probably knew about it, and it might have been kind of common knowledge more in Washington. But, this was a book that was published, 3 years after Lincoln's assassination. Right. It was available nationally. And I was doing a little bit more newspaper research the other day, and I was kind of surprised to see how widely it was excerpted in some of the newspapers, which of course, just like today, you get one thing and it goes out on the AP wires. I was finding columns of excerpts. Wow. And they weren't even saying much about the book. It was almost all about about Mary Lincoln and some of the revelations. So, even if you had no personal knowledge or you hadn't heard a rumor of it, if you'd had access to a newspaper. And the thing about newspapers at the time is that some people sit down and read the newspaper, but newspapers were also read aloud or, shared widely. So you might have heard something, or, honestly, kind of like social media today. How often does something come on, a social media site, and you say to the people next to you, "Did you hear about this?" And so it may have been more well known.
And just a real quick follow-up, and I don't mean to put you in a spot, but was this sort of the first kind of an inside the White House book that was published in American history?
I don't know if it's the first one that was in American history. I mean, it was probably one of the first. I would venture to say it was probably the most really insider book,
Really?
at least for the Lincoln White House.
You're right.
I'm trying to, nothing else is coming to mind.
Previous presidents, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I mean, at least in terms of that, but also what's extraordinary about this one is that it was written by an African American
Yes.
woman as well.
Yes.
And one of the things that that was sort of interesting looking at some of the ways that people were reviewing the book is that at least one newspaper said explicitly, if she does that, how many other people are now not going to hire African Americans to work in their homes to have this kind of thing happen? And to some degree, that may have been kind of a wake-up call for many elite households, again, because we read so often throughout history that people often don't see the hired help.
Sure.
And so they're very forthcoming about information because these folks are kind of part of the wallpapers that they're concerned. But here was someone who came out and published a book that shared a lot of intimate revelations.
Interesting. So I will open up for questions, and if you're online watching, please type in a question because we can get to those as well. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd like to say you did a nice job,
Thank you.
and mine is a comment on the question, but I have seen even locally where tombstones were removed from cemeteries and used for fill. Locations of different places.
Right.
And I went to a funeral memorial place, and they said it's not common.
Right.
Laboring Sons Park, just down the road over here.
Well, and I think sometimes I know one place where they think that there are tombstones that kind of make up a floor in a basement somewhere. So particularly if places are moving a lot, or like Harmony Cemetery moved at least 3 times.
Right.
And I think maybe in the 19th century it was even more common to do that.
Yeah.
But when you're finding them as ripraps, and I think now it hits us more strikingly because it's for an African American cemetery that already when you're already having to deal with a lot of discrimination and to find your loved ones on the shore of but when sometimes cemeteries just fall into disrepair too, because that's a lot of private cemeteries or family cemeteries. If there's no one there who's taking care of it or watching it, then all sorts of they can fall over, they can break, vandals can take them and
sort of
reuse the materials.
The talk I gave last month was
Yeah.
this local cemetery that's fallen in tremendous disrepair here, and the stones are all over the place in there.
Yeah, and I will just say that partially because I love cemeteries a lot, that when you're dealing with cemeteries, that they're always, the maintenance of them are incredible, because I follow along with Congressional Cemetery and Oak Hill Cemetery and some of the ones in Georgetown. And just the appeals that when a tombstone falls over, even if it hasn't been vandalized or something, because particularly if it's not granite, it's marble. I mean, marble just deteriorates incredibly. And so to maintain a cemetery of any size actually requires a lot of investment. And just a lot of places don't have that, or they become unused and someone's like, well, let me just reuse this gate post or this, this tombstone for something else.
Sure. Yes, ma'am.
First of all, thank you for a wonderful, very informative and interesting lecture.
Well, thank you.
Arch had a project for a number of years where they were getting volunteers to clean and renovate African American cemeteries.
Could you make sure you get that? What's the acronym for ARCH?
African American something.
Yeah, I don't want
And heritage.
Margaret, go ahead. Repeat that.
African American research, culture, and heritage.
Thank you. I didn't want to get to the office. They have their office is fairly close by, and they've had a project to renovate
Yes, they have.
and restore. That's good.
I'm not sure if it's still going on, but I was,
Right.
they just cleaned the cemetery and
Yeah.
tried to repair some stones, but I questioned their methods because it was volunteers.
Oh,
sure, anyway, that was just something that,
Mhm.
Well,
my real question is.
oh,
Okay.
sorry.
No, go ahead, if you want to continue on that.
No,
Okay.
I'll just babble forever.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mrs. Keckly grew up in a time when in many places, most places, it was illegal to teach your slaves or enslaved people or any African descent people to read and write.
Mhm.
And obviously she is quite literate. And sometimes when an enslaved person was a member of the white family because of the sexual assault by the master of the house, his children were often treated better than the other slaves.
Mhm.
You know, for example, the Jefferson family. But so I'm just wondering about her education and how she became literate and the skills, the seamstress skills were a lot more commonly
Right,
had than they are today. But
right.
just her literacy.
Well, and it's, it's a good question, and it's been a while since I read her autobiography, I reread it over again, and I don't remember if she addresses when exactly she was picking up education and learning. I mean, I think obviously she was signing her name and documents by the time she got to Washington, but I don't really remember, because another problem that we have is there's so few documents in her hand, too, and that's kind of, because one of the questions I always anticipate coming up is some people say, did she even write the book? And because there's no manuscript that I'm aware of, there's so few documents in her hand, there aren't manuscript pages that, kind of help solve that problem like it does with Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs, because
Sure.
we've got them all written out. So so again, I don't exactly know, I don't remember if she addresses when she gained literacy or if she was picking it up as part of, being in the household of the Garland family. Her son obviously gained literacy because he went off to university, so maybe that was also a way of picking up. So like I said, I don't remember if she addresses it, but she's literate enough to sign her name and operate a business and do all of these things that she needed to do, but also to what level she was, I don't know either.
Any online queries?
Yeah, one related to that question actually. Jane Slip says, I'm reading her book. I was struck with how literate and insensitive it was. It was amazing how she could produce this, as she did not become literate until later in life. Any thoughts on how she would address this rapidly?
So just to repeat it,
Yeah.
Dean Slent, did you say?
Jane Slip.
Jane, okay.
And he gave some praise too.
Okay, the question was, again, related
Yeah.
to literacy, how he's reading Keckly's book now, and he's struck by how good it is.
Oh, it's a marvelous book. I mean, sometimes it kind of veers a little bit into the purple prose of the 19th century, but it is very well written. It's very literate. She tells very compelling stories in that, and I think that's also maybe to some degree why people have asked whether she even wrote it or not.
Right,
Whether
could there have been a ghostwriter?
there could have been, and what I usually say is I don't have evidence to say she didn't,
Right.
and so I don't have hard
Right.
evidence about her doing it,
Uh-huh.
and so I tend to come on the side of without evidence that she didn't do it. But obviously something happened along the way, because she wouldn't necessarily have put that appendix in. And so there may have been someone who was helping with the stories, or an editor who was polishing things up, but we just don't know enough about the process of her writing it. But again, just sort of the reviews that I was looking at the other day, partially because I was trying to find that national intelligence or advertisement about, she'll cut and fit things for you. And so that kind of, let me tell you, when you go into historic newspapers, if you're interested in this stuff, it is a rabbit hole. All of a sudden, 2 hours later, you're still doing it. But even in the reviews that I was looking at, apart from, the racist parody of Betsy Keckly, nobody in 1868 that I happened to see that day was saying, oh, and she couldn't have possibly written this. So, people were accepting that she was either the author or at least the source of it. And then later on, you get into the, like the David Rankin Barbies with, oh, this woman couldn't even have existed. This has to just be a pseudonym for somebody else. So.
Okay, let's see. We'll start in the back.
Thank you, also, wonderful talk. I have two questions.
Mhm.
One is, I don't know if you know more, could you speak to the Contraband Aid Society that she was the
Oh,
president
sure.
of?
Mhm.
And then I may have missed this, how you became interested in this topic, especially from the West Coast?
Right. Okay, let me talk about the Contraband Aid Society first, and then if I forget about the personal stuff, remind me. So the Contraband Aid Society, and the background is, and to some degree, I think historians are getting away from the word contraband anymore. It's an interesting time to be in history as we're reevaluating the words that we're using when you've come across them for so many years. So the contraband issue came up in May of 1861 because when Benjamin Butler, who by the way is a fantastic historical subject, he is so much fun. Everywhere Benjamin Butler goes, something is going to happen. So he's a great person to research and be a part of. But anyway, he was the commander down at Fort Monroe in Hampton Roads. And three, whose names I'm not going to remember right off the top of my head, but three enslaved men came and basically sought refuge at Fort Monroe. And Butler took them in, thought, we can put them to work. Well, then a representative of those men's, owner came and said he wants them back. And so, essentially Butler doesn't want to give them back, for one thing. And so they're claiming, well, according to the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, you have to do this. And Butler kind of said, well, you've seceded. You're in a foreign country. We don't have to do this anymore. And so, but then he basically came up with this idea of, we'll accept them as contraband of war in the same way as if we had a wagon, a cannon, a horse, anything else that is enemy property that we have come across. It is our contraband of war, and we will put it to work for us and deprive the opponent of its use. And so, he kind of did let Washington know, I have this idea, is this okay? And they said, fine. And so that's where escaped slaves or enslaved people become known as contraband. And the reason they do this, partially, is because, this is really early in the war. If you say, we're taking them and we want to emancipate them, even the northern public that's not gonna fly. So I've seen articles, I think Edward Pierce has a great one where he says, the man in his easy chair at home is perfectly fine with contraband, not so fine with emancipation. So once you call them contraband, it's in a whole different designation. So when you're working in Civil War, kind of African American studies, slavery and all of that thing, you'll come across the word contrabands a lot. And so the Contraband Relief Association, that's where the name comes in, because it was a federal territory, slavery was abolished in D.C. It was compensated emancipation, but still emancipation, in April of 1862. And of course, that word gets out in Maryland and Virginia and everywhere else in the area. So a lot of escaped slaves come to Washington, D.C. because slavery doesn't exist there anymore, and there's also opportunity and that's where the government is, and that's where they might be able to get employment. So, essentially it's a migration problem, or it's a migration problem of the 19th century of people coming into an area to seek refuge and a new life, and not having the ability or the finances or the resources to be able to, kind of house themselves and do all of this immediately. So that was what Elizabeth Keckly and some of the government agencies were trying to do, because this is before the Freedmen's Bureau exists. And again, one of the things about working in the 19th century is it's sort of fun to see the federal government go, oh my God, what do we do about this problem? Because it's a lot of stuff that they hadn't anticipated. Right. Even when you're dealing with medical problem, all these things that nobody had anticipated.
Well, isn't this when you say it's America's first huge refugee crisis?
It is a huge refugee crisis.
We have 4 million people at various points knocked loose from enslavement, and some of the first government housing for civilians that's built are these refugee camps. It's the first government housing for non-military people.
And there's a lot of them in Washington. And this is kind of part of my dissertation, is the idea that wherever the Union Army went during the war, change followed. So if you were in upcountry Alabama, maybe nothing changed for you on a day-to-day basis during the war, other than what you heard and, everybody, guys going off to war. But essentially, if you're on the I-95 corridor, a lot is happening all the time for 4 years. And when the Union Army is nearby, that's one of the things that prompts a lot of enslaved people to escape, and they meet various receptions while they're there. but it's a chance to either work for somebody or take refuge with the Union Army or maybe get to Washington or somewhere else. So it becomes a problem, particularly in DC, and Elizabeth Keckly and some of her kind of cohorts try to raise money to then give them basic
I
necessities.
think probably a lot of this is just, it's so ad hoc. You know, it's just people trying to respond to this crisis.
Right.
Because the government just can't manage it all as quickly as possible. There was a question right
Oh,
here.
and the personal part of it. Let me get you the personal part.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
You'll be third. Okay.
I don't remember when I first came across her, but I do. It was the undergraduate seminar where I ended up writing a paper about her, and you know, our UCR library had an old copy of Behind the Scenes. And so I remember clearly like being on my couch in my apartment taking copious handwritten notes because I didn't have a computer at that time, because that's my era, that I didn't have a computer, and taking a lot of handwritten notes about her. And I just found her so fascinating and her life, and I always loved the Lincoln story and the Civil War. So there was just something that I found very interesting about her. And that was kind of where I thought to myself, like, all right, if I get an A on this paper, I'll go lay flowers on her grave. And it took a while, but I got there. And initially when I got to Cal, I was going to do my dissertation on her. And then I started thinking, well, I actually need to get out of grad school at some point, and you know, and this might be a subject that would be very difficult to research at that time. So then I just expanded it to African American women in Civil War Virginia. So she's always been kind of a part of my life in some ways, and it kind of migrates in and out. But I was so thrilled when I got to work on this essay that in the book that Dana and I are both in, because it gave me the prompt to go back to her grave, because I'd been kind of busy and I hadn't seen the new one. And it was only when I started working on this that I realized how much her tombstone and grave mirrored what was happening in terms of how people viewed her. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is great. So she's been a very nice part of my life.
And Mandy,
All I wanted to know was their ages and how close in age they were.
Of Mary Lincoln and
Yes.
okay, so actually they're about the same age, because Elizabeth Keckly was born in 1818 in Virginia, and if I'm remembering correctly, I think that was Mary Lincoln's birth year too, because Abraham Lincoln was a little bit older than she was. So, but they were contemporaries in age. And interestingly, kind of contemporaries on opposite sides of things, because Elizabeth Keckly had been an enslaved woman in a household of enslavers in Virginia, whereas Mary Lincoln had grew up as a privileged child of the Todd family in Lexington, Virginia, for whom they had enslaved women in the household. And those were the people that she gravitated to the most, because she, you know, her mother, Mary Lincoln's mother, died when she was very young and didn't get along with the stepmother and the, you know, gazillion other children that came afterwards. And so she was very close to her grandmother and to, I think it was Mammy Sally, I think was the name. But so, you know, they're kind of almost like, you know, mirror images in some ways of that they grew up in similar households, I guess, but just on opposite parts.
They were born in the exact same year.
Okay, good. My memory is getting a little more fuzzy as I get older.
sir, you had a question.
Sorry for throwing a second question at you.
Yeah, fine.
But a few years back, St. Catherine Drexel built their new church out on Possumtown Pike in a farm property. I think it was maybe the Garst farm. But at any rate, there was a family cemetery there, which they protected and originally didn't do anything with. But now they established that cemetery.
Yeah.
And they did a ground penetrating radar search of it. And using the history books and so on, they found 2 Civil War and a Revolutionary War veteran.
Interesting. One last question. Well, wait.
Well, I'm happy to go as long as you're willing to.
We're going to take 1, 2, and 3, and then we'll call one last call for questions after that. Go ahead, Dean.
So I have an observation and a question. I'm wondering about Keckly's the criticism of the book and all the excerpts. How much of that might have been driven by partisan politics? So the spring of 1868 still in the throes of, quote, radical reconstruction. So Democrats were railing at Republicans and at Lincoln, Lincoln to damage the Republicans. And it was late spring of '68, we're entering the presidential election season where Grant's elected. So I'm just wondering how much of that might have driven some of it, and which newspapers were actually the ones criticizing.
Right.
And then the other, I just wanted your opinion, why do you think she actually wrote the book? Because she must have known that Mary Todd Lincoln would not have liked this. So it almost seems like she's mad at Mary Todd Lincoln and wants to get back at her. Or is it to get money, she needs the money? Why do you think she wrote it?
Okay, so let's do the why she wrote it and then the political part of it. Well, I mean, to some degree, we can only go on what she tells us. And she, at least in the book, she says, essentially this is a woman who's been very maligned and criticized. And there's probably an element of, maybe if I tell people what she was really like and all the trials and tribulations that she had gone through in her life. Because the other thing is, it's kind of it's a sort of a weird book in the sense that until 1860, it's all about Elizabeth Keckly. And so it's a slave narrative, it's, her life, it's a little kind of behind the scenes of what happens in enslaved households. And then, the Lincolns come on the scene and it's like Keckly kind of disappears, other than some of the things that she's doing. But there may be a part of it of, if you really understood what the trials the woman had gone through and a little bit about her as a person, maybe people would think a little bit more kindly of her, and particularly if she didn't anticipate all those letters being published at the end. But at the same point, she is divulging a lot of very personal information at a time that people don't do that. But there is also, I think, an element, and she says this explicitly, is this is a maligned woman, and she has been very criticized for her actions, particularly with the old clothes scandal and trying to get a pension and all these other things that she's done. I think a lot of people felt that she acted very unladylike, and she didn't have a lot of friends. Let's just be honest about that. She didn't get along with a lot of women in Washington. She didn't have a lot of champions. Even B.B. French, who liked her before, was like, okay, on her way out, I could tell my diary so many things about her, but I'm just not going to do it. We all wish she had. But anyway, but this is kind of guilt by association for Elizabeth Keckly. And so if you think badly of her, or you think she has behaved in an unethical, bad way, then that casts on me as well. So this may be a little bit of, this was my role in it, and I tried to behave as upstandingly and as ethically as I could to help this woman who had so much influence over me and needed me so much. Maybe she thought that there would be a monetary payout on this. It doesn't seem that there was. The book sold for $2 in 1862, which is not a trivial amount of money for people. But there was one review that was like, oh, they've already sold out of the first printing at whatever. But I don't know that she ever saw the money from that. And then it ended up being disastrous for her because of what would she say about other people that she's worked for? And, so I don't know that she may have anticipated quite the negative consequences that came out of it, even though it seems pretty clear to us, like, how could you not see that this was not going to go over well? The political aspect of it, honestly, there could be some of that. And the reviews that I saw in some of the Southern newspapers were not very surprising. And maybe, some of the Democrat, but the National Intelligencer was one that kind of surprised, that was interesting, because it tended to be the more kind of upscale newspaper in Washington. And it said specifically that while or kind of paraphrasing, well, we have not always really been fans of Mrs. Lincoln, and normally wouldn't take pains to come to her defense. This is an awful thing that's happened to her. We loved Mr. Lincoln, but not so hot on Mary. And so there could have been a little bit of that. I think it's more human nature that we love to read about scandals. And how often do we all click on something about like the Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt never-ending divorce, or J-Lo again, or, we're all clicking on that kind of stuff because it's interesting and that's what sells. And so I think that may have been more of a publisher's decision of, okay, we'll pretend this is a book review, but let's just print, 2 columns of all the excerpts about Mary Lincoln, not how horrible slavery was.
And you had a question here?
I just had a question about when you mentioned that her son passed away,
Mm-hmm.
and then just a little bit, and then she got benefits, I guess, when he died.
Mhm.
How open and secretive was it at that time? To pass for white, and I guess it was in a white regiment.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And she was black, and then how was she allowed to get benefits? I mean, how secret was that? How hard is that as an historian to figure out when somebody passes for white, where they go, what happens to them?
Right. From what I understand, and it's interesting because I remember looking, I think it was one of my first summer in Washington, I got out her pension at the National Archives. And it was interesting in there because I seem to recall, and I could be wrong, but I seem to recall that she claimed to have been married to Alexander Kirkland. Because the thing you have to understand about pensions is it's all, well, first of all, they don't want to give you any money if you don't deserve it. And that early in the war, somebody has to be killed or seriously wounded and be able to prove disability. And you also have to prove all these relationships. And particularly as a mother, you're supposed to prove that this person was contributing to your support. Now, I think in Elizabeth Keckly's case, even though she claimed to be married to Alexander Kirkland, to the father of her child, I don't think she ever, she never was, but I think she had to claim it. But I think Keckly was in a kind of different position because she worked for the Lincolns. And I want to say that she got the pension maybe in '62. I could be wrong about that. But, people, when you work for the Lincolns or you work for the White House or you have political friends in Washington, I suspect, I don't know for sure, I suspect that could have smoothed over some of the qualifications or the regulations that might have been investigated a little bit more closely with other African American pension or African Americans. Because I've looked at a lot of African American women's pensions, particularly wives, and like if they step out of line at all, the pension gets taken away because you're supposed to be upholding this kind of memory and be like a virtuous mother and a virtuous wife or widow and all of that. So I think it was obvious that her son had died and people knew who he was. But the machinations of actually getting the pension may have been finessed a bit.
All right, last question, sir.
You kind of glanced on it briefly. I didn't know much about, you mentioned the book that came out that claimed that she didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
What was the research behind that? What did he write when he, took that accusation back?
Yeah. Well, so David Rankin Barbie was a journalist in Washington, I think, and I know his papers are there. So he claimed that she didn't exist. And then Johnny Washington, who was an African-American kind of Renaissance man, he was a teacher and I think a dentist and an amateur historian, he did all these things. But he had grown up in Washington, D.C., not too far away from Ford's Theater, and in an African-American neighborhood. And he remembered his grandmother and people talking about, they had known Lincoln. And so that kind of prompted him. And he said, no, I know all these people who know her. And so Barbie never wrote a book about Keckly. I think he just kind of lobbed these accusations. And then when someone said, oh no, we've got all these people who remember her, okay, I stand corrected. But then that prompted Johnny Washington to write the book, They Knew Lincoln, which is about all of these African Americans, particularly in Washington, who knew him in some fashion. And I think it's still one of the best sources for other parts of Keckly's life, because Washington had access to a lot of documents. Nobody knows what happened to Washington's papers, which is a tragedy, because he had copies of documents and he had fabric samples, and he had known all of these. And some of the documents he reproduced in the book. And so Keckly is a huge part of that book because she was so intimate with the Lincoln White House and was so known in Washington. So thankfully, because Johnny Washington wrote the book, we had all this information. We had the pictures of her tombstone that we wouldn't have had without that. But then like I said, the book was published in 1942 and then went out of print. So, you could hardly get a copy of it for a long, long time until it was reproduced. But I do have to tell you a fun story. The cover that I have in my PowerPoint is actually my personal copy from 1942, because in the dawn of the book buying on the internet age, I was looking for a copy and I didn't know how scarce they were. And I saw that they were selling one for something like $25 for the Friends of the Framingham, Massachusetts Library book sale. And one of my friends' mom lived in Framingham. So I was like, could you go down and get this book for me? And it turned out that, I'd paid a pittance for it and they were going for like $300 or something like that. Yeah, so I have been very privileged to have a copy of the 1942 edition.
Well, thank you so much.
Well, you're so welcome.
It's a fascinating story on so many different levels. It's not, well, I'm guessing it's not a coincidence you're wearing also a purple sweater.
No.
Just making that parallel. But thank you very much, Michelle.
Thank you for having me.
This is Talk. Elizabeth Keckly. And thank you all for attending today and helping make this a great success. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. Thanks.